He was 12 years old. He should have been playing with wooden blocks or learning to ride a bicycle. Instead, Hans is crouching in a pile of rubble in Berlin, holding a weapon that weighs almost as much as he does. Across the street, a 40-ton Soviet T-34 tank is turning its turret toward him. Hans has been told he is a hero. He's been told that the final victory is minutes away. But as the steel monster closes in, he realizes the terrifying truth. The men who gave him this uniform have already fled, and the invincible Reich has sent its children to die in its place. How did an entire generation of children become the last line of defense for a madman? And what happened to the boys who survived the nightmare of 1945? Today, we peel back the propaganda to see the heartbreaking reality of the child soldiers of the Reich. The harvest of the innocents. Crouches behind a jagged remnant of a brick wall. His oversized steel helmet, an M42 that belongs on a man twice his size, slips forward, obscuring his vision. He pushes it back with a hand stained black by oil and white by plaster dust. He is trembling, not with the fervor of a warrior, but with the rhythmic, uncontrollable shiver of a child in the grip of a fever. Across the debris-strewn Friedrichstrasse, a Soviet T-34 tank rounds the corner. It is a prehistoric beast made of iron. Its diesel engine produces a low-frequency growl that vibrates in Hans's teeth. In his lap lies a Panzerfaust. It is a crude tube of explosives designed to be fired once and discarded. To use it effectively, Hans must wait until the steel giant is less than 30 meters away. He's been told he is a hero. He's been told the Führer is counting on him. But as the tank's turret rotates, searching for life among the ruins, Hans doesn't feel like a hero. He feels the sudden, sharp ache of wanting his mother. He remembers the smell of her starch-heavy apron. The tank treads crunch over a discarded bicycle. Hans grips the firing lever. The playground has become a parade ground, and the parade ground has become a graveyard. To understand how a 14-year-old boy found himself facing a 30-ton tank with a suicide weapon, we must look back a decade. The tragedy of 1945 did not begin with the first Russian shells falling on Berlin. It began in the sun-drenched meadows of 1935. The radicalization of Germany's youth was not a sudden rupture. It was a calculated chemical process. The slow poison of ideology dripped into the ears of a generation until they could no longer hear the voices of their own parents. In the mid-1930s, the Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, did not look like a death cult. To a 10-year-old boy, it looked like an invitation to the greatest adventure of his life. The summer camps. These were the primary recruiting grounds for the soul. Under the guise of character building, millions of boys were taken into the German countryside. The brotherhood. Around evening campfires, they sang songs of blood and soil. The flickering light masked the individuality of their faces, merging them into a single collective organism. The ritual. High-altitude hikes and physical trials gave them a sense of purpose. They weren't just children anymore. They were the new German man. The Nazi Party understood a fundamental psychological truth. If you control the leisure of a child, you control their heart. They systematically dismantled the influence of the church, the Boy Scouts, and most crucially, the family unit.
The party did not physically kidnap these children. They stole them emotionally. They created a generational rift where the state became the true father. Parents who attempted to pull their children back found themselves silenced by their own offspring. Children were encouraged to report reactionary comments made at the dinner table. The sanctity of the home was breached by the uniform. When a boy donned the brown shirt and the swastika armband, he felt a power that his weak or old-fashioned parents could not provide. The state offered a seductive trade. In exchange for your childhood, we will give you a destiny. This theft was facilitated by a total takeover of the German education system. The classroom was no longer a place of inquiry, it was a laboratory for indoctrination. Every subject was weaponized to serve the racial narrative. The mathematics of dehumanization. Consider a standard math problem found in a 1930s German textbook. It did not ask about the velocity of a train or the area of a field. Instead, it asked, the construction of a lunatic asylum costs 6 million marks. How many houses at 15,000 marks each could have been built for that amount? Another problem asked students to calculate the lifetime cost to the state of supporting an individual with a hereditary disease. By the age of 12, a student had been taught to view human life as a ledger of profit and loss. They were trained to see undesirables not as people, but as mathematical burdens, clutter to be cleared for the master race. By 1939, the transition was complete. The playground had been entirely swallowed by the parade ground. The games the children played, searching for spies, practicing with air rifles, endurance marches, were no longer simulations, they were rehearsals. The tragedy of the 1945 child soldier is that they were the most perfect products of the regime. They were the only ones who truly believed the lies until the very end, because they had never been allowed to know a world without them. While the older generals and the disillusioned soldiers of the Wehrmacht saw the writing on the wall, the children of the Volkssturm, national militia, saw only a holy war. They were the final harvest of a regime that had spent 12 years sharpening its scythe. As we return to the ruins of Berlin, we see the result of this decade-long experiment. We see Hans not as a combatant, but as a victim of a monumental state-sponsored crime against the concept of childhood itself. Hans breathes in the grit of the city. The T-34 is now 40 meters away. The roar is deafening. He remembers a song from the 1935 camp, "The flag is more than death." He wonders for a fleeting second if the flag will feel warm when the metal meets his bones. He stands, he aims. He is a soldier who hasn't yet learned how to shave.
The Candy Division. The sun glints off the polished belt buckles of 1,000 boys standing in perfect, rigid formation. These are the recruits of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. At first glance, from a distance, they look like any other elite Waffen-SS unit. But as the camera moves closer, the illusion fractures. The faces are smooth. No stubble shadows these jawlines. Their uniforms, though tailored, seem to swallow their narrow shoulders. In the spring of 1944, the German war machine was a wounded predator, bleeding out on the Eastern Front. In a fit of desperation, the High Command looked to its last reserve, its children. They called them the Baby Division. A supply sergeant tosses a ration pack onto a wooden table. There are no cigarettes here, no bottles of schnapps or bitter rye brandy. Instead, the crates are filled with fruit candies, chocolate bars, and tins of sweetened condensed milk. A young soldier, barely 16, tears into a tin with a bayonet and licks the thick, cloying syrup off the blade with a grin. The logistics of the 12th SS were a surreal marriage of the nursery and the barracks. While the Allied soldiers across the Channel dreamed of girls and beer, these boys were fueled by sugar and a decade of bedtime stories featuring the Führer as a god.
They were the only soldiers in the world who had to be taught how to shave after they had been taught how to kill. The architecture of fanaticism. The training of the 12th SS was unlike anything the Allied intelligence had ever seen. While a regular conscript might be motivated by duty or fear, these boys were motivated by a terrifying, joyous vacuum. They had been raised in a closed circuit of Nazi ideology since the age of 6. They did not fear death because, to a 17-year-old, death is an abstract concept, something that happens to old men in books. They saw the coming battle as the ultimate field day, a grander version of the summer camps they had attended in 1935. They practiced live-fire drills with a reckless disregard for safety that appalled their veteran officers. They crawled under whistling machine gun fire as if it were a game of tag. They weren't being trained to survive, they were being calibrated to explode. The air in the bocage, the labyrinth of ancient stone walls and thick, tangled hedgerows, is thick. It smells of crushed grass, diesel exhaust, and the acrid, metallic tang of burning rubber. The summer heat is oppressive, humming with the sound of flies and the distant rhythmic thud, thud, thud of naval artillery.
Creeps through a gap in a hedge. He is a veteran of the landings, a man who has seen the worst of Juno Beach. He raises his Lee Enfield rifle as a figure emerges from the smoke of a burning Panzer IV. He freezes. The enemy is a boy. His helmet is lopsided. He looks like he should be delivering newspapers in Toronto. The Canadian hesitates, his finger hovering over the trigger, a moment of human mercy flickering in his eyes. That hesitation is nearly fatal. The boy does not surrender. He does not cry. With a scream of Sieg Heil that cracks in the middle of the vowel, he lunges forward, pulling the pin on a Model 24 grenade. The British and Canadian troops who met the 12th SS at Caen were horrified. They expected to fight men. They found themselves killing children, who fought with a ferocity that bordered on the demonic. A child's bravery is a terrifying thing when it is directed by a madman. The fighting in the hedgerows became a nightmare of close-quarters slaughter. The teenagers of the 12th SS didn't understand the rules of engagement. They didn't understand that when you are surrounded, you lay down your arms. In one sector, near the Ardennes Abbey, a group of 5 Hitler-Jugend boys were cut off by a Canadian tank troop. The standoff. Surrounded by Shermans, the boys used the shadows of the stone walls to move like ghosts. The act. A boy, no older than 15, sprinted into the open. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was clutching a Haftholladung, a magnetic anti-tank mine. He ignored the hail of machine gun fire that kicked up dust around his boots. The result. He slapped the mine onto the side of the lead tank. As the explosion rocked the lane, the boy was cut down, his body tossed into the dirt like a broken doll. He died with a smile of triumph on a face that had never known a lover's kiss. By the end of the first week of combat, the 12th SS had gained a reputation for 2 things: incredible bravery and staggering war crimes. Having been taught that mercy was a sign of racial weakness, they executed prisoners in the gardens of the Abbey. They were a generation that had been stripped of their conscience before it had even fully formed. The cost of this fanaticism was total. By the time the remnants of the division were pulled back from the Normandy front in August, the Candy Division had ceased to exist. Of the 20,000 boys who had marched into the hedgerows, nearly 8,000 were dead, wounded, or missing. They were the harvest of the ideology, a crop grown in the 1930s and mown down in a single summer.
Interior, Berlin apartment, night. A mother sits by a dim lamp, clutching a letter. It's written in a loopy adolescent hand, asking if she can save him some apple cake for when he returns. Outside, in the streets of Berlin, the sound of marching feet continues. But these feet are smaller. The stride is shorter. As the elite teenagers of the 12th SS bled out in the dirt of France, the Reich looked back toward home. The 17-year-olds were gone. The 16-year-olds were dying. The eyes of the Nazi leadership now fell upon the 12 and 13-year-olds waiting in the schoolrooms of Berlin. The monster was hungry, and it was starting to eat its own young.
Scraping the bottom of the barrel. The camera panned slowly across a line of new recruits standing in the slush of a melting snowfall. The sight is not one of military might, but of a grotesque masquerade. A boy, Peter, 12, stands at the end of the line. He is wearing a greatcoat meant for a 6-foot grenadier. The hem drags in the gray mud, and the sleeves are rolled up into thick woolen donuts at his wrists. His helmet, the dreaded Stahlhelm, is so large that it rests on his ears, wobbling with every shudder of his small frame. By the winter of 1945, the illusion of the master race had dissolved into a farce. The professional army had been swallowed by the Russian steppe and the fields of France. In their place stood the Volkssturm, the people's storm. But this was no storm. It was a desperate, gasping breath. These children were not wearing the armor of heroes. They were wearing the hand-me-downs of dead men. The camera lingers on a button missing from Peter's coat, replaced by a piece of coarse twine. This is the miracle weapon Hitler promised, a child with a runny nose and a coat that smells of mothballs and the previous owner's sweat. The footage is grainy, flickering like a dying pulse. Adolf Hitler emerges from his bunker like a ghost, retreating from the light. He is a ruin of a man. His left hand is tucked behind his back to hide a violent neurological tremor. His skin is the color of parchment left in a damp cellar. He walks down a line of 12-year-old boys from the Hitler Youth. Among them is Armin Lohmann, 12, who has just been decorated for destroying a tank. Hitler reaches out. He does not shake the boy's hand with the grip of a leader. He pinches Armin's cheek with a sickly, grandfatherly affection. This is the final image of the 1,000-year Reich, a trembling dictator rewarding a child for the privilege of dying in a gutter. If you look into the eyes of the boys in that footage, you don't see the fire of fanaticism anymore. You see a hollow, glass-like stare. They are looking at a man who has sold their futures to buy himself one more hour of life in a concrete hole. 30 meters of steel. The primary tool of these children was the Panzerfaust. It was a weapon designed for the desperate, a hollow charge warhead on a metal tube. A grizzled, one-armed veteran stands before a chalkboard, showing a group of boys how to aim the device. Veteran, you wait until you can see the oil on the tank's bolts. If you fire at 50 meters, you miss. If you fire at 30, you die from the blast. You fire at 40, and maybe you live. The Panzerfaust was a suicide contract written in steel. To use it, a child had to remain motionless while a 30-ton T-34 roared toward them, the earth shaking beneath their boots. They had to ignore the screaming instinct to run. The weapon itself was a physical burden. It was heavy, awkward, and cold. When fired, the backblast was a dragon's breath of flame that could incinerate anyone standing behind the shooter and singe the hair off the boy holding it. It was a one-shot weapon, one shot to save a city that was already gone.
While the radio stations blared Wagner and announcers screamed that the children will save Berlin, a different war was being fought inside the damp cellars of the city. The air smells of wet coal and cold potato soup. Frau Meyer is huddling in the corner, her hand clamped over the mouth of her 13-year-old son, Stefan. Above them, the heavy thud of jackboots echoes on the pavement. These are the flying courts-martials, patrols of fanatical SS officers and military police who roamed the ruins looking for deserters. The greatest horror for a German mother in 1945 wasn't the Soviet shells, it was the German gallows. The SS were hanging children from lampposts with signs around their necks that read, "I was a coward and refused to protect my fatherland." Mothers hid their sons behind false walls, under floorboards, and in the soot-stained corners of coal bunkers. They were fighting a silent, desperate rearguard action against their own government to keep their children from being harvested by the people's storm. Every knock on the door was a potential death sentence. The Stalin-Organ Katyusha rockets begin their terrifying, high-pitched scream. The sky turns a hellish shade of orange. In a shallow foxhole, Peter, the boy with the oversized coat, is no longer trying to look like a soldier. He is curled into a ball. The heroic songs of the summer camps are gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic whimpering. He is calling for his mother, but his voice is drowned out by the thunder of 10,000 guns. The propaganda spoke of iron will and final victory, but reality was the sound of a child's voice cracking as he tried to report for duty, and the smell of a boy who had soiled himself because he was too terrified to move. The Nazi leadership had spent 12 years telling these children they were the masters of the world. Now they left them in the mud to face the vengeance of a world they had helped set on fire.
The meat grinder of Berlin. Berlin is no longer a city of music and spires. It is a jagged, blackened skeleton of brick and iron. The sky has disappeared behind a permanent shroud of black smoke, a thick, oily veil composed of pulverized history and burning rubber. By late April, the geography of Berlin had changed. Maps were useless. The streets were choked with mountains of rubble 3 stories high. The only rhythm left in the world was the thud, thud, thud of the Stalin organs, a drumbeat that never stopped, vibrating through the soles of boots and into the very marrow of the bone. A small hand, blackened by soot, reaches out from a cellar window to catch a flake of falling ash. It looks like snow, but it's warm. It's the remains of a government building 2 blocks away. The Spree River reflects the hellish orange glow of the burning city. On the bridge, a group of 15 boys, none older than 14, hunker behind a barricade of overturned tram cars and sandbags. They are the guardians of the bridge. Their officers, men in their 30s with medals and maps, disappeared 3 hours ago. Some said they went to scout the rear. The boys know better. They know they've been left behind. They aren't fighting for National Socialism anymore. They aren't fighting for the 1,000-year Reich. They are fighting for the boy to their left and the boy to their right. It is a brotherhood of the doomed. They have 3 clips of ammunition each and a single loaf of bread that has been gnawed on by rats. Konstantin, his face smeared with grease to hide the paleness of his skin, checks his rifle. His hands are small. The fingers still have that soft, rounded look of childhood. He tries to spit, but his mouth is too dry. It tastes of brick dust and sulfur. The silence of the bridge is shattered by the sound that haunts the nightmares of every survivor, the metallic, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of Soviet tank treads. A 3014 tank emerges from the smoke of the Friedrichstrasse. It is an iron leviathan, its long barrel sniffing the air like a predator. The vibration is so intense it shakes the dust from the boys' uniforms.
Imagine being 4'10" and weighing 80 pounds, facing a 30-ton machine of death. The heat from the tank's exhaust ripples the air. You can hear the Soviet crew shouting inside over the roar of the engine. Stefan rises from the rubble. He is trembling so violently the Panzerfaust rattles against his shoulder. He still has his baby teeth. 2 of them are slightly crooked. He takes a breath, his lungs burning with the smell of cordite. He aims. The tank turret begins to turn. For a heartbeat, the boy and the machine stare at one another.
If the front was a meat grinder, the rear was a gallows. While the children fought the Russians, the SS fought the children. The camera moves past a row of lampposts. From each one hangs a figure. They look like laundry drying in the wind until the wind shifts. They are boys, some in tattered HJ uniforms, some in civilian coats. As the Red Army closed in, the Nazi flying courts-martials moved through the ruins like scavengers. These were fanatical units whose only job was to ensure that the will to fight did not waver. Any boy found without a signed order, any child trying to sneak back to his mother's cellar was declared a defeatist. A white sign is pinned to the chest of a boy swinging from a wire. The ink has run in the rain. It reads, "I am a coward. I preferred to live while my comrades died." He looks like he's sleeping, except for the purple line around his throat. He was 14. He had been trying to bring a piece of bread to his little sister. As the city's surface became uninhabitable, the war moved underground. The tunnels are a claustrophobic hell. They are packed with thousands of wounded soldiers, crying civilians, and the stench of gangrene. In the flickering light of emergency lanterns, small shadows flit through the darkness. The children were the only ones small enough to navigate the rat lines. They were used as runners, crawling through collapsed sewer pipes and narrow vents to deliver messages between bunkers that no longer mattered. They moved through the filth, clutching pieces of paper that ordered divisions to attack, divisions that had been wiped out weeks ago. They were the nervous system of a dead body, sending signals to limbs that were no longer there. The Stalin organs go silent. The machine gun fire ripples out into a few scattered pops, and then nothing. The silence is heavy. It is a physical weight that hurts the ears. From the shattered windows of a basement, a white bedsheet is poked out on a broomstick. The shooting has stopped, but for the children of 1945, the nightmare is just entering a new phase. Stefan crawls out of the bridge debris. His face is white with shock. He watches as a column of Soviet infantry moves down the street. They are tired, muddy, and fueled by 4 years of unimaginable rage at what Germany did to their own villages. Stefan looks down at his hands. He is still holding a grenade. He looks at the Russian soldiers, men who have lost their own children to German guns. He realizes with a sickening clarity that he is no longer a heroic defender. He is a prisoner of an army that has every reason to kill him where he stands. The grand adventure of the Hitler Youth has ended here, in the mud of a ruined street, surrounded by the smell of the dead. The children are alone. The shadows of the Reich. A column of American jeeps winds through a dark wooded road in Thuringia. The soldiers aren't relaxed. They scan the tree line with jittery intensity. Suddenly, a twig snaps. A 19-year-old GI from Ohio pivots, his M1 Garand barking into the brush. He stops. He approaches the target. In the dirt lies a boy of 15 with a rusted bolt-action rifle and a face full of acne. The war was over, but for the Allied troops, a new nightmare had begun: the werewolf. Goebbels' propaganda had promised a fanatical underground resistance of children who would slit the throats of occupiers in their sleep. In reality, the werewolf program was a disorganized failure, but its legacy was lethal.
It created a climate of total paranoia. Allied soldiers, exhausted and traumatized, began to see every teenager in a tattered coat as a potential assassin. It led to shoot-first tragedies across the countryside. The Nazi leadership had painted a target on the backs of their own children, ensuring that even in peace they would be hunted like animals. The camera moves through a frozen, skeletal forest. The only sound is the wind whistling through the pines. Then, a movement. Eric, 9, huddles in a burrow dug beneath the roots of a fallen cedar. His skin is a translucent gray stretched tight over his cheekbones. His fingers are raw and bleeding from digging for frozen tubers. He is one of the Wolfskinder, the wolf children. In the east, the collapse was even more primal. As the Red Army swept through East Prussia, thousands of children were separated from their families in the chaos of the Great Retreat. Left with no one, these orphans fled into the vast, dark forests of Lithuania. They lived like ghosts. They forgot their names. They forgot the German language. They survived by eating grass, tree bark, and the carcasses of horses left in the snow. They were the master race, reduced to the state of scavengers, forgotten by the world and feared by the locals. For them, 1945 wasn't the year of liberation. It was the year the world turned cold and stayed that way. For 12 years, these children were the center of the universe. They were told they were the inheritors of the earth, the biological elite. Now, the world had flipped. The reality, the invincible German soldier was a prisoner in a muddy field. The shame, the sacred swastika, was now a mark of Cain. The labor, boys who had once been given medals by the Führer, were now being rounded up for forced labor, clearing the heavy, jagged debris of the cities they had failed to defend. Narrator VO, the psychological shock was a total system failure. Imagine being 14 and realizing everything you were ever taught, every book you read, every song you sang, was a lie designed to lead you to a grave. They were spat on by the very civilians who had cheered them months prior. They weren't heroes. They were the living evidence of a national shame.
The room is silent except for the whirring of a film projector. A group of 50 boys, still in their shorn-off military tunics, sit on wooden benches. They are being shown footage from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald. The camera stays on the boys' faces. Some stare with a blank, catatonic expression. Others cover their eyes. A few whisper that it's Allied propaganda, a final defense mechanism of a brain that cannot accept the truth. But for most, the collapse is visible. They see the piles of bodies, the undesirables from their math problems, and they realize they were the guards of a slaughterhouse. The Allied youth camps were an attempt to deprogram a generation of janissaries. But how do you fix a soul that was built on a foundation of ash? When the lights came up, the silence in those rooms was the sound of 1 million childhoods ending at once. They had fought for a new order that was, in reality, a factory of death. A boy sits on a pile of bricks, staring at the moon. He isn't wearing a uniform anymore, just a tattered sweater, but when he hears a car backfire, he hits the dirt in a programmed reflex. History moved on. Germany rebuilt. The ruins became glass skyscrapers. But for the boys of 1945, the war never truly left the room. It lived in the way they flinched at loud noises, the way they couldn't form bonds of trust, and the recurring nightmares of the T-34's treads. You can take the uniform off a child, but you cannot take the war out of his soul. They were a lost generation in the most literal sense, lost to their parents, lost to their morality, and lost to their own futures. They were the final bitter harvest of a madman's dream. These aren't just statistics. They are a tally of stolen potential. Each number represents a boy who should have been a doctor, an architect, or a father, but instead became a footnote in the history of a collapsing Reich.
The long shadow. The camera glides over a city of glass, light, and motion. The Tiergarten is lush and green. The Spree River flows calmly under bridges of steel and reinforced concrete. There is no smell of cordite here, no black smoke, but beneath the pavement of the Potsdamer Platz, the ghosts of 1945 remain buried under layers of progress. When the guns fell silent, a different kind of wall was built, not of brick, but of silence. In the 1950s and 60s, as Germany underwent its economic miracle, the boys of 1945 became the men of the Reconstruction. They put on suits, they worked in factories, and they raised families. But they did not talk. They buried their tattered HJ uniforms in the deepest corners of their attics and their memories in the deepest corners of their minds. To admit you were a child soldier was to admit you were once the face of the most hated regime in human history. They lived in a great silence, a collective amnesia born of the shame of having been the final fanatical shield for a monster. An elderly man, Gunther, 92, sits in a leather armchair. The light of the setting sun catches the liver spots on his hands. His fingers are gnarled with age. He watches his grandson play a video game on the rug, a digital soldier running through a digital war. Gunther looks at his hands. To his neighbors, he is a retired clockmaker, a man who enjoys his garden and his tea. But he remembers when those same hands, small and trembling, fumbled with the heavy safety of a Mauser rifle. He remembers the weight of the Panzerfaust and the heat of the backblast that took the hair off his forearms. He didn't have a teenage rebellion. He didn't have a first dance or a high school graduation. His childhood wasn't lost. It was stolen, piece by piece, by a state that viewed him as a biological resource rather than a human being. He is a grandfather now, but in the quiet moments before sleep, he is still that 12-year-old boy shivering in a damp cellar, waiting for the world to end. The story of the child soldiers of 1945 is often treated as a historical anomaly, a unique madness of a unique time, but that is the most dangerous lie we can tell ourselves.
The tragedy of the Hitler Youth is not a German story, it is a human one. It is a warning of what happens when the playground is surrendered to the state. It is the blueprint for every conflict since, where children are given Kalashnikovs before they can read and slogans before they can think. When ideology replaces education and when the state replaces the father, the result is always the same, a harvest of the innocent. 1945 showed us that you can take a normal, happy child and, with 10 years of slow poison, turn them into a weapon. The radicalization of youth is a fire that, once lit, consumes the future to pay for the sins of the present. When a survivor visits a memorial today, he isn't there as a veteran of a glorious campaign. He doesn't stand with his chest out. He stands with a bowed head. He isn't mourning a comrade in arms. He is mourning the boy he used to be. He is mourning the version of himself that never got to grow up, the boy who died on a bridge or in a trench, even if his body kept on living for another 80 years. History is written by the victors, and the legends are written for the heroes. But the children of 1945 fall into the cracks of both. They were the last victims of a war they didn't start, fighting for a man who didn't care if they lived or died. We look back at them with a mix of pity and horror, but as we close this chapter of human darkness, we must ask ourselves the most uncomfortable question of all. If you had been born in that time, in that place, if your teacher, your father, your radio, and your friends all spoke with one voice, would you have been any different? Or would you too have been standing on that bridge, clutching a weapon you didn't understand, waiting for the steel giants to arrive? History calls them soldiers. Reality calls them children.